Thank you, Kavya. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to this great edition of the Economic Times Global Business Summit. We have with us Mr. Piyush Gupta, who, as the Chief Executive Officer of DBS, one of Asia's biggest banks, really needs no introduction. And who better than to talk about the digital economy, the transformation that we are probably talking about and seeing happening in front of our eyes, and the digital technology that is really revolutionizing the Indian corporate landscape, other than Mr. Gupta, who's not only been a veteran at DBS, but has also observed India from a close quarters and knows really what's really happening in this country. So without much ado, Piyush, I would just like to talk to you about this very, this question that has been dominating everybody's minds over the last, say, 3-4 months. We talk about digital in a very big way, but is it all sound and fury without anything that is really permanent and substantive? Or is there something that India can really do to harness the power of the digital economy, harness the power of digital technology, and really transform the economy in a very fundamental way? What do you think, sir?
So, Ram, first of all, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show. And to dive directly into your question, I think the last 3-4 months have been seminal, game-changing almost. Without a doubt, I call this phase hyper-digitalization because without a doubt, the pace of digital adoption globally has been just dramatic. McKinsey, in fact, I think said more digitization happened in a quarter than in the previous 5 years. And this has been at both ends of the spectrum. On the one side, it has been in the production space, the way work gets done. As you know, around the world, India was, of course, a leader in this. Everybody had to learn to work from home, work from remote, and do this instantly. This has got some fairly profound consequences because even though work habits had started changing, flexible work was beginning to be flirted with, it was not being done at scale. In the last 6 months, with everybody having to work at home with a gun to their heads, two things have happened. Companies and firms have upped their technology game to be able to create, VPNs and VDIs and firewalls, etc., to be able to do work remotely. But secondly, the psychology of people has changed. The risk appetite of companies has changed. The willingness to accept work from remote has changed. Now, I believe that this is really, really important to India. India exports some $80 billion of software services. It's been the country's biggest export in the last 20-30 years. I think over the next 5 years, you could see this increase exponentially and manifold. And the reason for this is that large number of the companies which had earlier figured they could outsource or offshore some percentage of their work have now come to the realization that they can actually outsource and therefore offshore substantially more of their work than they had hitherto believed. At DBS, for example, we were doing some small part of our work outside the office premises around the region. Today, I believe we can safely do 70-80% of our work outside of office. And if it's going to be outside of office, then that gives us the opportunity to do it anywhere. It doesn't have to be in Singapore or in the major countries we operate. It could be Bangalore. It could be anywhere in the world. And if you take the thought further, if it can be from anywhere in the world, then you have to believe that India stands particularly a great opportunity to leverage of this. The language skills, the back office skills, the extant infrastructure, all of these to me make the likelihood that the whole offshoring industry, the offshoring space will increase rapidly. By the way, there's one other trend that's going to make this even more relevant, and that's the trend of nationalism. The H-1B issues in the US are also being coupled with similar issues in other countries about foreigners and foreign talent. Well, if you can do the stuff from remote, then that's quite easy. The other side of the spectrum is the demand side. Again, people's capacity to consume. I didn't tune into the last session, but I'm assuming our previous speaker spoke about that as well. Consumption habits have changed. So the amount of online commerce, online consumption has increased exponentially, and particularly in some sectors. You take healthcare. So telemedicine, telehealthcare, tele-wellness, these things were really just fractional. The acceptance of that has increased quite dramatically. You take another sector, education. Now, the company EdTech has been taking off in India. People like Baiju But now around the region, around the world, people's willingness and appetite to accept education online has completely changed. These kinds of things, whether it is the wellness space, whether it's the medtech space, whether it's the education and edtech space, these are real opportunities for India to be able to play a meaningful role from an export standpoint. Lastly, I think there's a real opportunity to continue to transform India. I mean, I know people talk about digital India and how successful it has been and not. But truth be told, even in India, the acceptance and pace of digital consumption over the last 3-4 months has changed meaningfully, not just e-commerce, but across everything. And therefore, we now have 4,000-5,000 education startups, healthcare startups. There's no reason for that not to increase. I've seen data which suggests that health tech could be a $20 billion growth industry in the next 3-4 years in India, giving employment to several millions of people. And similarly, education in multiple languages could be quite significant for the country. We were talking just before I got on, Ram, agriculture with some of the new agriculture bills. I think that could be tremendously benefited by AgTech as well. So I think the opportunities in the back of this are actually not just sound and thunder and fury. I think there's some real opportunities out there.
Right. That's two very interesting points, Piyush. One is about the software services of where we already have a leading edge and we've been pioneers in that for quite some time now. And the other is the scale and adoption of digital consumerism and digital technology in corporate workplaces and in shop floors around the country, which obviously, as you are saying, has increased manifold in the last 3-4 months. Now, here is where I think we can make the next big leap. Not just in software services, where we already done quite a bit, but here is where we can probably make the next leap in digital consumerism and in digital adoption in companies and workplaces. What do you think the government needs to do? The government needs to do?
I think, frankly, we have a good existing infrastructure. I mean, both the hard and soft infrastructure. We have more engineers coming online, and we have great facilities which are already in place. But we still sometimes tend to shoot own goals. One area where I think we need to rethink our philosophy, India's philosophy, is around our policy on data. So today, particularly in recent times, the concern around data privacy, data leakage, onshoring of data, etc., has been paramount. And it's easy to understand where that comes from. Data nationalism is not just an India phenomenon, it is in many countries. However, if we are going to offer and see this as a huge possibility for the country, then we're going to have to make sure we understand that free flow of data to and fro is going to be critical. It is hard to anticipate and say we'll work in a world where we say no data can move out of the country. But by the way, everybody in the world should try to use India for some of the technology and digital services. It doesn't work that way. So we're going to have to be a lot more thoughtful and pragmatic about what our data policies are, what needs to be onshored, how we can actually leverage on the free flow of data. One of the things we've got to remember that when we talk about this big opportunity, it is not just processing or not just putting technology, it is actually using data intelligently. So you expect data to flow into India from everywhere. So AI and machine learning and a whole bunch of different tools can be used. And then that's got to be shipped out again. And I think a lot of countries and firms are uncomfortable with the one-way traffic, that, your data needs to move into the country but can't move out of the country. So that's clearly something which I think the government needs to think a lot about.
Right. Do you think the current policy or the government policy towards having some kind of get the digital lending platforms and the digital payment systems to have some kind of data set up here in India where the data would be stored, is that the right way, or is that a kind of a middle path, or do you think that's too extreme?
Well, some countries have done that as well from a resilience standpoint. You want one set or one copy of the data to be onshore. And frankly, I think that is not unreasonable to make sure you can ring fence and have some of it. Where I think Indian policy goes overboard is the requirement that the data must only be onshore and cannot exist outside the country. Now, that is no longer a resiliency issue. That is a data nationalism and data protection issue. So I think a better policy would be to say we need to have data onshore. We need to have one set of the data onshore. It's a resiliency requirement. But then beyond that, if data needs to flow out and be free because firms and companies need to use it to aggregate for regional and global purposes, then that's a sensible requirement for firms and they should be allowed to do that.
Right, right. One of the interesting things about data technology, digital transformation, and digital consumerism is that does it finally give India the chance, the opportunity to provide for equitable growth? One of the things that we've seen, especially in the the roaring 2010s, if I may say, the first 10 years of the 21st century, was that we had a lot of growth that we as a country never saw before. But we also saw it concentrated in a few pockets. There was NCR, then there was this from Gujarat right down to Tamil Nadu, the entire peninsula and Western India, which saw massive growth. But a lot of other states kind of missed out on that. Does the rural focus of this government, which the policies that have recently been announced, and does the fact that digital transformation and digital consumerism give us a chance to set that right?
I think the opportunities are quite real, Ram. Frankly, even before, we take some of the policies of the government, we take the Jan Dhan account scheme. Now, the 300 million people who have a bank account, and the last time Rajneesh told me, Chairman SBI, that they had some fairly sizable balances in those accounts. Right. Bringing the people into the formal system was helpful. The whole Aadhaar scheme was helpful. I think this capacity to leverage new technology, whether it's for healthcare or for education or for agriculture, like I said, I think that will help get some of the economic possibilities more broadly spread into large parts of rural India. So I think the possibilities do exist. However, it's not obvious. I mean, it won't happen by itself. It does require some putting your shoulder to the wheel. You take agriculture, again, we were talking before. In the past, the view used to be that if you were not a scale farm, you could not get economies, right? But in today's day and age, technology lets you be productive even in small scale. Netherlands is full of small scale farms, which are very, very productive, both urban farming, hydroponic farming, etc. However, to make them productive, you need the technology input. You need AgTech, you need platforms to sell, you need advice on soil, fertilizer, weather conditions, etc. So if we actually work in building an AgTech industry, partly public sector, partly private sector, then some of the benefits will start trickling down to rural communities and farm communities. So I think the platforms and the opportunities are there, but it's not going to happen by itself. It requires some conscious focus and policy thrust.
Of course, conscious focus and policy thrust. What do you think of the government's reform announcements so far? They made quite a few over the last 3-4 months. Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, trying to build an industrial manufacturing base, trying to get some production out of this country rather than depend on imports. A lot of countries are doing that. India is not just the only one. Would this really help in putting India back on the growth track? Remember, we are not really talking about getting back just to the pre-COVID levels, which is 5-6%, which is what we saw last year. The ambition should be higher, get down to 8-9%. What are these policies enough, and what new policies do you think the government can do?
So again, I think these are good policies because that's the second big trend. So if you think about the mega trends around us, the hyper-digitalization is one. The second big mega trend is obviously the trend on the back of geopolitics. The issues between America and China are very, very significant. What is also some of the realization from COVID that you need to build resiliency into supply chains. That's very important. So people are now shifting from this thing of just in time to just in case. Now, a just in case thinking and a China challenge means that a lot of companies are going to be looking at least a China plus one strategy, if not an ex-China strategy. And so you can really see a meaningful shift or a meaningful shift in new manufacturing investments looking for new homes. Where does this go, and who are these people and where does it go? So, we did some work. We looked at the Apple supply chain. And we identified about 200 people who contribute to the Apple supply chain. About 110 of them were from either the US or from Taiwan or from Japan. If you ignore the Chinese companies themselves, 50-60% of the supply chain is owned in Japan, in Korea, in Taiwan, and the US. All of these people are looking for a new home. Now, where do they go? If you assume that they're sticking in the region, you can go to Vietnam, but Vietnam is a small market. And as soon as you put some production there, prices of land and the labor start going up. So it can't scale.
Right.
Outside of that, India is actually a very, very viable place to shift manufacturing to. And we are seeing that many of our Korean clients, many of our Taiwanese clients are really seriously, it's not just the Foxconns of the world, it's also the Winstrons and others moving production to India. Some of the policies over the last few this thing have been helpful. So I think for the domestic market, GST, the insolvency thing, they make things easier, give line of sight to companies have been helpful. On the electronic sector, some new financial incentives, you can pick up 5-6% productivity incentives from the government. So I think that is helpful. I think overall, even though the center state issues and the bureaucracy in India continues to be challenging, but a lot of companies in this region have started figuring their way around it. So I do think that those possibilities are real. There are a couple of things that you still need to do from a policy standpoint. I think labor productivity is still not as high as you would find in China. So reskilling and continuous technical this thing is something that the country needs to focus on. I think the labor policies themselves need further liberalization. So, some labor, this thing can be quite sticky. And frankly, one very simple thing, we've tried to do it, which is a single point of interface to be able to troubleshoot. That would be helpful. Now, I know we have Invest India, but the truth is that Invest India just finds it hard to work relative to all the agencies and center state. So we need to create an agency which has more teeth and more capacity to troubleshoot, exactly like EDB does in Singapore for inbound companies into Singapore. So all of these could facilitate the process, but I do think that these policies are all positive and good.
Right.
So looking at to Atmanirbhar Bharat, so the issue there to my mind is, as long as we don't go back to a 1960s import substitution only India situation, it's not bad. Having a local content policy is not a bad thing. But if you get to a stage where you tell companies that everything that you assemble in India must be sourced in India, well, you can forget being part of a global supply chain. If you think about a phone manufactured in China today, those parts come from everywhere. So Singapore supplies them, and Thailand supplies them, and Malaysia supplies them, and then they pick it together and then they export it. So if you really want to be part of a network system, you cannot, block out any imports of raw materials, any imports of components, any imports of parts. Assemble in India needs to be as important a part as make in India. And to do that, we've got to take a slightly more pragmatic and more level-headed view to what does Atmanirbhar really mean.
Right. Okay. So some of the things that, as you yourself said, a lot of the companies are looking to shift some or transfer some production facilities to India. Would you say that we are, or the country is in the same position that China was in the early 1990s, just before they got their act together and they really ramped up their manufacturing and manufacturing capacity and manufacturing industry? Are we on that road, or are we really far away from that?
I think the opportunity is there, but I said there are two caveats. Caveat one I spoke about. In China, you don't have a democratic system. So you don't wind up with every state government doing its own thing and every bureaucratic department doing its own thing. If they put their mind to it, they get tremendous alignment, not just with the policy machinery, but with the execution machinery. So, of course, that's something which is not easy in India, so we got to wrestle with. But there's a second caveat. And the second caveat is to do with finance. China's big advantage for the last 30 years has been the capacity to fund their growth. It became a self-fulfilling positive, because then they started exporting, and then the foreign exchange reserves allowed them to have the resources to keep doing that. But in the first instance, the government created programs to be able to make financing easily available for a lot of these companies to get started. The problem in India today is the financial system is in bad shape. It was in bad shape pre-COVID, and I think it's going to be in even worse shape post-COVID. I don't think the shoe is dropped. I think the real challenges you will see over the next 12, 18 months of this post-COVID. So I think you're going to have to think hard about how do you finance some of this. And one of the things that would have to be considered is something which is traditionally a sacred cow, which is allowing foreign direct investment and overseas financing and money to come in, not just in debt form, but in equity form. If you are open to that, then you might be able to crack that nut. Otherwise, that will be a hard nut.
Right. When you talk about financing problems and challenges, you're obviously referring to the bad loan situation that may probably get out of hand if we are not too careful, right?
we're talking the bad loan, impending bad loan situation, but also talking to the fact that the amount of capital in the industry was already low. So the Indian banking sector is relatively small by international scale. It is relatively undercapitalized. And then on top of that, you have a slew of bad debts and bad loans coming down the pike. So you got to deal with that as well.
Right. So we are really running out of time. We have just time for one small question here, and I asked Bill Winters this, so I'll ask you this as well. Given the kind of scale of digital transformation and digital consumerism taking place, and given the fact that you guys already have a bit of an edge when it comes to digital banking, are you in a mood to now really go after the Indian retail customer? Where, a lot of foreign banks really did not do that very aggressively in the last 10, 15 years because the Indian banks were already very well entrenched. But now, does this give you an opportunity? I'm talking about DBS.
Yep. The short answer, Ram, is yes. As you know, we're the only foreign bank other than the small Mauritian bank, which applied for a wholly owned subsidiary in India. And that is just because of a commitment to build out the retail and the small business business. If you only wanted to stay in the large corporate space, you don't need to subsidize. So that obviously is a statement of intent. I do think what you said is correct. Our digital capabilities allow us to compete differently. So we're going to double down. And this whole opportunity of digital change and digital transformation, I think will give us the opportunity to continue to scale up our investments and double the pace of our potential growth. Now, having said that, I'll also hasten to add that with all of these things, you've got to be sensible about timing. And because of what I said about the other shoes still to drop, it might be foolish to do a lot of consumer lending over the next 2 or 3 quarters. So we'll be a little bit thoughtful about the nature of the portfolio and when we put the foot to the pedal on that account.
Right. Of course, a mixture of caution and aggression. Thank you very much, Piyush. Nice to have this conversation with you and pick your brains about really what's going to happen and how India can scale up and take advantage of the structural shifts that is taking on in the post-COVID world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. A pleasure being with you, Ram.